is Jill from the Cozy Company. Today I'm going to be showing you a video tutorial on how to accomplish 6 different types of beginner stitches. So in today's video, we are going to go over the knit stitch, the purl stitch, garter stitch, double garter stitch, herringbone stitch, and the broken herringbone stitch. Regardless of what stitch you're trying to accomplish, we are going to start our blanket the same way. So what I'd like everyone to do is find the end of your yarn. We're going to call this the tail of your yarn. We are going to make a loop similar to the breast care awareness symbol with the tail on top. We then want to take our working yarn. Our working yarn is the yarn that's attached to our ball of yarn, and we want to put it up and through that loop that we just created. We're going to grab it with one hand and pull down at the same time to tighten. Now when doing your first row, I like to keep my loop sizes a little bit bigger, maybe about 3 fingers wide. Just know that the larger your loops, the holier your blanket will be, and the smaller your loops, the tighter knit your blanket will be. So everyone now has a loop similar to the breast care awareness symbol with a knot right here. This is called our slip knot. To make our foundation chain, what we're going to do is take our thumb and our pointer. We're going to put it through that loop that we created. We're going to grab and pinch that working yarn from the front towards the back to pull up a new loop the same size. We are then going to take our thumb and our pointer and put it through our new loop. We're going to go through the front towards the back, grab and pinch that working yarn to pull up another loop the same size. We are going to continue that process until we get to our desired width. It's important to stay consistent with your loop size throughout your whole blanket. If you start your foundation chain loops too small and your loops get bigger, you're going to end up with a very tight base. So I have just chained on 20 foundation loops. Again, you just want to go until you get to your desired width, but I'm going to use 20 as a good demonstration. So regardless of what type of blanket you are trying to accomplish, this foundation chain is going to be the same throughout. The next step is also going to be the same, regardless of what blanket you're trying to accomplish. So this is the very last loop that we just pulled up with the foundation. We are going to be working back this way towards the tail. So on your foundation chain, there are bumps or ridges through the top of the foundation chain all the way throughout. We're going to be working through these bumps. So right next to this loop that I just pulled up, I'm going to find my very next bump in my foundation chain. I'm going to put my thumb and my pointer through, grab and pinch my working yarn. So I'm going to put my fingers through the front towards the back, grab and pinch that working yarn to pull up a new loop the same size. So now we have 2 loops sticking out of our foundation chain. I'm going to go to my very next bump in my foundation chain, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to put my fingers through the front towards the back, grab the working yarn, and pull up another new loop. So now I have 3 loops sticking up. I'm going to continue going all the way down my foundation chain, pulling up loops through those bumps. Again, you want to stay consistent with your loop size throughout your whole blanket. So at the end of the row, what we should be seeing is our foundation chain with a bunch of loops sticking up. The very first stitch that we're going to learn is the knit stitch. The knit stitch is going to be the foundation stitch for pretty much any blanket you will make in the future. No matter what stitch you're trying to do, you will usually always incorporate some sort of knit stitch. So with knit stitch blankets, I always like to skip the first loop in each row. So what I mean by that is this is the very last loop that we pulled up. This is the very last thing that we did. So now that there's no more loops to pull up going this way, we are at the end of our foundation chain. We are going to start working back this way. Because this is the very last loop that we pulled up, instead of going in this loop to bring up our new row, I'm going to go right to our second loop. So similar to what we just did with the bumps, or the ridges in our foundation chain, we're now going to do with each and every one of these loops. So starting in the second loop in, I'm going to take my thumb and my pointer again. I'm going to put it through the loop going from front towards the back to grab and pinch that working yarn and pull up another loop the same size. I'm going to leave that as it is, go to my very next loop and do the same thing. Take my thumb and my pointer, put it through the loop going from front towards the back, grab and pinch that working yarn to pull up a new loop the same size. I'm going to continue that process going all the way down the row, pulling up loops through these previous loops that we made. And we always want to stay going from the front towards the back for the knit stitch. Again, just important to stay consistent with your loop size. No matter if you have big loops or small loops, you just want to stay that size throughout the rest of your blanket. So now that I've reached the end of this row, I'm going to do the same exact thing going back this way. So again, because this is the very last loop that we pulled up, and there's no more loops to go this way, instead of pulling up another loop here to bring the next row up, I'm going to start right in my second one. So again, in my second loop, take my thumb and my pointer, put it through the loop from the front towards the back to pull up a new loop the same size. Then I'm going to go to my very next loop, put my thumb and my pointer through, grab and pinch that working yarn to pull up another loop. I'm again going to continue this process going all the way down my blanket until I get to the end. So once again, I've reached the end of my row. I'm going to start working back this way. So instead of going through this very last loop that we just pulled up, instead of going through it again to bring up our new row, I'm going to start right in the second one. So putting my thumb and my pointer through that second loop, I'm going to grab and pinch the working yarn to pull up a new loop the same size. And I'm going to continue going down each and every loop until I get to the end again. So I've just done 4 rows of the knit stitch. I'm going to do one last row of the knit stitch before we move on to the purl stitch. So again, this is the very last loop that I just pulled up, and instead of going through this loop again to bring up my new row, I'm going to start right in the second one. So I've just completed 5 rows of the knit stitch, and as you can see with the knit stitch, it gives you a nice columned look. You can visibly see all the columns created with that knit stitch. I've changed my color just so we can see the difference between the knit stitch and the purl stitch easier. Now the purl stitch is probably the second most basic foundation stitch that you have in chunky knitting. Most stitches going forward are a combination between a knit stitch and a purl stitch. So to accomplish the purl stitch, we are going to take the working yarn and put the yarn through the front towards the back of the loop. So the purl stitch is the opposite of a knit stitch. For the knit stitch, we grab the yarn from the back like this and pulled it through. With the purl stitch, we're bringing the yarn to the front and pushing it towards the back. So we do the same thing, we go through each and every one of the loops, but we put the yarn from the front towards the back. And the purl stitch gives a little bit of a raised look. So it's really just the opposite of a knit stitch. So we've just completed the end of the first row of the purl stitch. As you can already see, there's a difference in the texture between the purl stitch, which is more raised, and the knit stitch that we already did. Now it's up to you with the purl stitch if you'd like to skip this first loop like we did with the knit stitch. As you can see with the knit stitch that it gives you a nice braided edge. So I will show you what it looks like on this side to skip the first loop, and I will show you on the other side what it looks like to not skip the first loop. So this is the very last loop I just pulled up, so I'm going to start right in my second loop and again put the yarn through the front, going towards the back. So I've just completed my second row of the purl, and again, very visibly see the difference between the purl stitch and the knit stitch. The purl stitch is much more raised and more of bumps, while the knit stitch is more of a flat columned look. This is the side where I'm going to show you what it looks like when I do not skip that first loop in a new row. So this is the very last loop that I pulled up, so I'm going to go through it again. And I will keep moving on down through all my loops until I get to the end again. So I've just finished my third row of purl, and as you can already see the difference between this side where I have skipped and this side where I have not. This side is just a little bit more congested. So I'm going to do the purl stitch for 2 more rows, and then we will move on to our next. So again, this is the side where I'm showing you what it looks like when you skip the first loop. So I'm going to skip that loop and go right to my second one. And again, I'm just doing this so you can see the difference between the two. I would choose one and stick with it through the whole entirety of my blanket. I wouldn't go back and forth of skipping one or not skipping one. I'm just doing it to show you what the difference looks like, so you can use your judgment on which method you would prefer to use. So that was 4 rows of purl. I'm just going to do 1 more row and then we will move on to our next stitch. So again, this is the side where I am not skipping my first loop. So I'm going to go right back through this loop that I just did to start back the other way. So I've just completed 5 rows of the purl stitch, and now you can definitely see the difference between purl stitch and knit stitch. And again, this is the side where I skipped my first loop like we did with the knit stitch, and this is the side where I did not. So it just gives a little bit more of an uneven edge when you do not skip that first loop. But again, it's completely up to you whether you want to skip that first stitch or not. So I've just changed over my yarn again so we can see the next stitch easier in the blanket. So the next stitch that we're going to learn is the garter stitch, or commonly known as the single garter stitch. The garter stitch is just a combination of knits and purl. So to accomplish the garter stitch, we are going to knit 1 row and then purl another row. So I'm going to skip that first loop because I am working with knit, and I'm going to go right to the second loop. And I am just going to do a knit stitch like normal. So again, putting my fingers through the front towards the back to grab that yarn and pull up a loop. And I'm going to continue the knit stitch throughout the whole rest of the row. So I've just completed a whole row of the knit stitch. For the next row in the garter stitch, I'm going to switch to purl. So you can just continue going down the row, purls, just like we did here, but we just alternate our rows. So I'm just going down my row here, doing the purl, pushing the yarn from the front to the back of the loop. Now that is one option, to just keep alternating knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl. So I've just completed my third row. As you may have noticed, when we are working with knits and purls, we keep our blanket laying flat on the table and we just work back and forth. We do not flip our work. Because knit and purls are opposite, meaning that what you see on the front with knit is actually a purl on the back, and what you see with a purl on the front is a knit in the back. So you can see the difference here. This is the front of my work, this is the back. So knit, purl, purl, knit. So an option when doing the garter stitch is, instead of keeping your work laying flat on the table and alternating between knit, purl, knit, when you get to the purl side, so I'm on the purl side now, we can flip our work upside down and just continue the knit stitch, because this is the wrong side of my work. So on the right side of my work, this knit stitch will look like a purl stitch. Now this is a great option if you can remember what is your right side of your work and what is the wrong side of your work. I do not recommend this if you're having trouble figuring out what's the right side and what's the wrong side. A better option would just be to keep it laying flat on the table, working back and forth between the knit stitch and the purl stitch like we did in the first two stitch demonstrations. But I've just completed that row, and this is the wrong side of my blanket. So I'm going to flip it back over, and as you can see, that knit stitch that I created on the back side is a purl stitch on the front side. So I flip my work back over, and I'm just going to continue doing a knit stitch. So I've just completed another row. And again, if you are comfortable, you could flip your work and do a knit stitch on the wrong side. But because this is a beginner tutorial, I'm just going to keep it simple and do my purl stitch from the front. So again, taking the yarn from the front towards the back to give us that purled look. Once you feel comfortable, you can absolutely flip your work, or if it makes more sense to you, you can flip your work. But this is a more beginner-friendly option, as it doesn't involve you remembering on top of which row is a knit and purl, which row you need to flip your work on. So as you can now see, we've just completed a few rows of the garter stitch, or commonly known as the single garter stitch. And you can see the difference between the garter stitch, the purl stitch, and the knit stitch. So I've just changed my yarn color to green, so that way the next stitch will be more visible in the blanket. The very next stitch that we're going to go over is the double garter stitch. So the double garter stitch is almost exactly the same as the single garter or the garter stitch, except we do 2 rows of knit and 2 rows of purl. So we alternate knits and purls at a 2-row sequence, as opposed to the garter stitch where we did every other row. So I'm going to start with my knit stitch. So going from the second loop in, I'm going to just knit all these loops for 2 rows. As you can see, this was the side that we did not skip a loop when doing the purl stitch. You can see that it's just more cumbersome and not as even as when we do skip the first loop. So I've just completed one row of knit in my double garter stitch. So I'm going to do one more row of knit. And again, I always skip the first loop, but it is optional. And it's really just what makes most sense to you. So I've just completed 2 rows of the knit stitch. I'm now going to do 2 rows of the purl stitch. So again, it's up to you if you just want to do the next 2 rows of the purl stitch, going from the front to the back for 2 rows, or if you want to flip your work and knit for 2 rows. So I'm just for beginner's sake going to just go through the front towards the back to give us that purl look for 2 rows. So that was 1 row of purl. I'm going to do 1 more row of purl. Again, always skipping that first loop to give a nice braided edge. So I've just completed a total of 4 rows. I've done 2 knit and 2 purl. So with the double garter stitch, it's a sequence of 2 knit, 2 purl, 2 knit, 2 purl. So to see the pattern within this blanket, I'm just going to repeat this sequence one more time. So I am going to knit for 2 rows. I'm going to knit for 1 more row. So I've just done 2 more rows of knit. I'm going to do 2 more rows of purl so we can finish off this double garter stitch and you can see it within the blanket. So again, always skipping that first loop, I'm going to purl for 2 rows. So that was 1 row, and then I'm just gonna purl for 1 more row. I did 2 knit, 2 purl, 2 knit, 2 purl, just so you could see it within the blanket. As you can tell, it gives a much different textured look than the single garter, the purl, or the knit stitch. So I've just switched over my yarn so we can see the herringbone stitch be more visible in the blanket. And I also just knit 1 row because with the double garter stitch we had ended on a purl. So to do the herringbone stitch, I am on the right side of my blanket working towards the left. So we are essentially going to do knit stitches, but before we pull the yarn from the back towards the front, we are going to twist the loop in the direction we're working. So because I'm on the right side of the blanket working towards my left, I'm gonna take my loop and I'm gonna twist it towards the left. And then I'm going to knit stitch. So a trick that I like to do is I like to take my finger and I like to put it through the loop from the back towards the front. And then I'm going to twist the loop in the direction that I'm working. So I'm working towards the left, so I'm going to twist my loop to the left, and now my finger's in the front going towards the back, and I'm just going to pull up a loop. So I'm going to do that all the way down, taking each loop and twisting it towards the left, because that is the direction that I am working in. So I've just reached the end of my row. I am now on the left side of my blanket working towards the right. So I'm gonna do the same thing, except I'm going to twist my loops towards the right now. So again, what I like to do is take my finger through the back of the loop towards the front, and then I'm just gonna twist the loop towards the right, and then pull up a knit stitch. So again, take the loop and twist it towards the right. And we're gonna do this the whole way down. And we're twisting towards the direction that we're working in. So I'm on the left side of my blanket, working towards the right. So that's the way that I'm going to twist my loop. So I've just completed 2 rows. I'm going to continue that process for a few more rows just so you can see the hang of it. So I'm now on the right side of my blanket working towards the left. So I'm going to twist my loop again towards the left now. So I'm doing a knit stitch, but before I do the knit stitch, I'm twisting my loop in the direction that I'm working in. So that was row 3. And again, I am on the left side of my blanket, working towards the right. So my loops will be twisted right before I pull them up in a knit stitch. That was 4 rows. I'm going to do 2 more. I'm now on the right side of my blanket working towards the left. So all of my loops will be twisted left. I'm going to do 1 more row of the herringbone stitch before we move on to the next one. So I am on the left side of my blanket working towards the right. So all of my loops will be twisted to the right before I pull up a knit stitch. So we've just completed our 5th stitch. We have our knit stitch, purl stitch, garter stitch, double garter stitch, and our herringbone stitch. As you can see, they all give very different textures within the blanket. I've just switched over my yarn 1 more time so the very last stitch can be more visible in the blanket. The last stitch that we're going to learn in this beginner video is the broken herringbone stitch. So the broken herringbone stitch is a combination of the herringbone stitch and the knit stitch. So I've changed my yarn color over to a new color, so that way the next stitch we're going to learn will be more visible within the blanket. I've also just knit one row just so it will be a clean slate from the herringbone stitch. The last stitch that we're going to learn within this tutorial is the broken herringbone stitch. So the broken herringbone stitch is just a combination of knit stitches and herringbone stitches, meaning we're just going to alternate each loop between knit and herringbone. So I am going to knit my first stitch to give us that knit stitch on the end. Then on my very next one, I am going to do a herringbone stitch. Because I'm on the left side of my blanket working towards the right, I am going to twist my loop to the right and then pull up a loop. In my next stitch, I'm just going to do a knit stitch, and then again, I will do a herringbone stitch. Working from the left towards the right, I'm going to twist my loop to the right in the direction I'm going and pull up a stitch. So it's just a process of alternating between knit stitches and herringbone stitches. Now, if you lose track on what stitch you're on, you can tell pretty easily. This is a knit stitch, it's laying nice and flat, and the herringbone stitch just gives a little bit of a bump or a raise. So I've just finished my first row. I'm going to continue that process going back this way. So in order for the broken herringbone stitch to work, you always want to make sure you are knitting the same loop as you did in the previous row. So I ended with a knit stitch. I'm going to knit this one again, and then I will do a herringbone in my next stitch, but in the opposite direction. So I'm on the right side of my blanket working towards the left. I'm going to twist my yarn towards the left and then pull up a loop. And again, this was the stitch that I did just a normal knit stitch in, so I want to continue that pattern. And then herringbone stitch in the next one. And you just want to continue alternating every other stitch until we get to the end of the row. So you always want to make sure your ends end in a knit stitch. So I'm just going to continue that sequence. This was my knit stitch, so I'm going to do a herringbone stitch in my second one, but twisting it towards the right since that's the direction I'm working in. Knit, herringbone, to the right, knit, herringbone. Knit, herringbone, knit, herringbone. Just completed another row. I'm gonna just continue that process for 2 more rows so we can really see the pattern. So again, this was my knit stitch. So I'm going to do a herringbone to the left because that's the direction I'm working on. And then I'm just gonna keep alternating between knit and herringbone. And end in a knit stitch. So I'm just gonna do that for 1 more row. So again, this was my knit stitch. So my second stitch in will be herringbone, and I'm going to twist it towards the right since that's the direction I'm working in. And then I will just continue to alternate between those 2 stitches until I get to the end. Okay, so we have made it towards the end of our blanket. And now, does not matter what stitch you're working on, we're gonna end the blanket the same way for every single stitch. So whether you're doing a broken herringbone stitch, herringbone, double garter, purl, knit, it does not matter. We will be ending our blanket the same way no matter what. So in most stitches, we would usually skip this first stitch and go right to our second one. For the purposes of closing off this blanket, we are going to do a knit stitch in the first and the second loop just like normal. So we just have our 2 loops. We're then going to take the first loop, the loop on the outside, and we're going to put it over the loop on the inside. Then we're going to add a knit stitch in our next loop just like normal. So again, we have 2 loops, 1, 2. We're going to take the outside loop, and again, we're going to put it over the inside loop. Add a stitch like normal, so we have 2 loops, outside stitch, over inside stitch. So instead of working up like we have been for our blanket, we're now working over to close off all those loops and give us a nice braided edge. So I'm going to just continue that process all the way down. So I have my last 2 loops. I'm going to do the same thing until I have 1 loop left. Once I have 1 loop left, I'm going to cut my working yarn so I have a short tail. I'm then going to put my working yarn through the loop from the back towards the front and gently pull while holding onto the blanket. Once I do that, it creates a knot. I'm then going to find somewhere on the side close by. I like to go right here. Put that tail through again so it creates another loop, and then put that tail through that loop and pull one more time. You now have a double knot. You can do that step as many times as you'd like. I usually do it 2 or 3. And then whatever is left of this tail, you can either cut short or you can just weave it in through the top so it can't be seen. So we've now finished our tutorial on 6 beginner-friendly stitches. We have our knit stitch, our purl stitch, garter stitch, double garter stitch, herringbone stitch, and broken herringbone stitch. If you enjoyed this tutorial, feel free to head to our website and check out our other video with 6 intermediate stitches. Thank you.